One of the best things that you can do is build a lot of relationships with founders who are at your level, a little bit ahead of you, and even like a little bit, I don't want to say behind, but like a little bit smaller than you, so that you can start trading tips. And there are certain things that people won't share. And there are certain things that like we won't share. Like I won't tell people like exactly where we source our packaging from or something, because certain things are proprietary. But when it comes to things like a 3PL or what's called a third party logistics partner, or, a warehouse that's shipping out your product, that's where it can be very, very valuable to have those connections and be able to hear about like which places are great, which places are awful.
Welcome to Female Founder World. Today's conversation is with Trinity Mouzon Wofford, founder of Golde. Trinity, welcome to the show. To kick us off and get us started, I love to just always let guests tell us about their company in their own words, and also just give us a couple of milestones about Golde to let us know where the company is at and what stage you're at as a founder.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jasmine, so much for having me. So excited to chat with you today. So I am the co-founder and CEO of a wellness brand called Golde. We are all about superfood, health, and beauty. So everything that we make is powered by superfoods. That's everything from matcha to mushroom lattes to even a couple of face masks. So really just like thinking about telling that story of, making wellness easy and fun for everyone. And I co-founded the business 5 years ago now, almost 5. It'll be 5 years in January 2022. I started the business with my high school sweetheart, actually. So we go a little further back than that and, started like very humble beginnings, but, since then have really built this incredible community around the products. We have a great network of, independent retailers that sell our products across the country, but now also working with some of the bigger guys like Goop and Target. So it's been a really exciting journey so far, but still feels like there's so much more ahead of us.
I want to rewind just a minute and for you to tell us a little bit about your background and what your path to launching this company looked like.
Yeah, so I've always been really into wellness and actually for a long time thought that I was going to be a doctor and like go down that sort of field. And so I actually first got into wellness really through my mom, who has an autoimmune disease. And so she really struggled with it for many years, and at a certain point switched over to seeing this more holistically minded doctor, saw this incredible improvement in her symptoms. And, it was really like night and day for her. So that was a big moment for me. I decided, okay, this is going to be my career path. So I was pre-med in college and, was really focused on that, and all was well until I found out from my mom that she actually had to stop seeing that doctor because she just couldn't afford it anymore, which really just forced me to pause and consider what exactly it was that I wanted to do in wellness and how this piece of accessibility played into it. So that was really a lot of like what was going on my end prior to starting the business. And then I think like the big inspiration point for me was, just looking at my own experiences as a consumer in wellness and feeling very like caught between the sort of like crunchy granola stuff that I had grown up with, and then this like next wave of offerings that felt so prestige that it was just totally out of reach. So I was just really focused on this idea of like, how can we take the space of like superfoods and like make it a little bit more fun and accessible to all.
So you had the idea for this company. What were the things that you did early on to really A, test the idea, and B, get it off the ground and get that really early traction?
Yeah. So when we first started the business, both myself and my partner were still at our full-time jobs. So it was definitely a bit of a side hustle. And I would say like the number one thing that we did is we just kind of took our time and like thought through all of those different pieces, from like the branding to the product itself, the packaging, the pricing, where we were going to sell it. And so with that, I mean, there were so many different things that we had to think through. And with it just being the two of us, and at that time we were both like 22, 23 years old, we didn't have a ton of experience. We didn't have any funding to put into the business. So we just kind of learned our way through it and like figured it out and Googled around and, all of that. So a lot of it was just kind of like putting pen to paper and figuring out like what our mission was, what the formula was going to be for our very first product, which is our turmeric latte blend, designing the packaging for it, and then like starting to go door to door to different, cafes and, wellness shops and things like that. And, trying to get out there.
I think I first came across you guys at Chill House at their original Lower East Side location, which would have been years ago. That would have been like pretty early on. What was the strategy with picking like what cafes or retailers you were going to partner with? How did you intentionally go about that?
We really tried to go to spaces that had a lot of visibility and foot traffic, and that really told a story that aligned with our mission of, making superfoods part of your self-care routine. So Chill House was the perfect space. One of our very first retail partners, actually, because they're doing like nails and superfood lattes and, massages. And so it was so perfect for us to have our packaging, sitting on shelves like theirs. And at that time, we had this like really, still do, but I mean, we had this really like vibrant, eye-catching, colorful packaging that, especially back in like 2017, wasn't the norm. Like at that point, if you kind of like bring yourself back to then, that was a lot more of sort of like the minimalist, like stark white packaging with like black typeface. And so we really popped. And so I think that like very quickly, even though we were a teensy tiny business, people like you were going into, your favorite like wellness shops and cafes and seeing us around and noticing the packaging and like having this sense that like Golde was a brand they could trust.
So you also obviously like had the e-commerce piece of
Yep.
this, I'm guessing at the same time. Were you intentionally driving traffic to the e-com store early on, or was your focus really on these kind of like more bricks and mortar retail partners?
I mean, we did our best. We immediately like launched with an Instagram presence, started to like tell our story there, which I think was really powerful, and, started to build up a little bit of an online business. For the first couple of years, though, it was definitely like a very small part of our business overall. Like by far, wholesale was what was driving the majority of our revenues. And so I think that's kind of interesting because today you usually see brands starting direct to consumer first, and then like eventually they'll go into retail. But what we found was, as a small bootstrapped brand, one of the best things that we could do, was to partner with these more established retailers who already had, prime, foot traffic locations. They already had tons of digital traffic, if it was an online retailer. So we didn't have to put tons of resources into like Facebook ads or anything like that. We could just, grow the business profitably by having it sit on the right shelves.
I want to fast forward a little bit to when Golde started being stocked in some of these bigger retailers, more recent. How did that come about, and what kind of things like surprised you about that process?
It's a long process, and, Target, I mean, I had been talking to Target for years, and we had them like in our mind's eye as like, oh my gosh, this would be so perfect for Golde when we're ready. And so typically that process is like easily over a year, if not considerably longer, because you're first like getting introduced to a buyer, which just in and of itself can take a long time. You have to know someone or they have to reach out to you, whatever. So you have this like introductory meeting with the buyer. Sometimes they're keen and they're like ready to move quickly, but other times it's more of an introductory meeting. You're getting to know one another. You're sending them samples. You're like getting them to buy into the brand. And you also, this is a critical thing that I think a lot of people don't consider. You also are listening to them to understand what their goals are. What are their pain points? How can your brand help them to achieve their goals? And so like, even once you get to the process of, actually saying, okay, yes, like we're going to launch at this retailer, you have to go through contracting, there's item setup. If you're going to be like on their shelves and it's hundreds of locations, that's probably like months and months in advance of, when someone's actually going to like see it at their local store and be able to pick it up. So it's definitely a long process. You have to have the patience for it. And I think that's one of the most surprising things, is just that it's not like 6 months and it's long.
That introduction, like how does that happen? Did you guys use a broker or was it someone that you knew through years working in this space?
The Target intro is a fun story because I actually was at a breakfast event randomly in New York. And I sat next to someone who was New York based, but like she worked in like corporate at Target, not as a buyer, but she was fairly senior there. And, I was just telling her our story and she was so excited about it and said that, she would love to like make an intro. So that was actually how we got an intro to Target. I got introduced to the buyer. It took forever to get on like our first phone call with them because they're super busy. And then I think that buyer like moved on to a different place, which happens a lot, which is another thing you have to keep in mind. So they like moved, I think like internally to like a different department. So I had to like start over from scratch again, find the next buyer. And so like, it's always a bit of a process. And like, even when you feel like you've got like this perfect relationship with the perfect buyer, whatever, like they can leave. So you're always on your toes with retail partners, but it keeps it interesting.
Okay, so let's fast forward. I'm now, actually, this is probably around the same time. We're talking 2020, and I'm guessing a lot of the partners that you worked with, if you're working with like cafes, they're closing down, they're changing how they're operating. How did 2020 impact the business?
Oh my gosh, 2020 impacted the business on so many levels. So first off, the pandemic. So yes, you're right. On the wholesale side of things, like a lot of our like independent retailers like shut down, some of them permanently, sometimes some of them just, temporarily. So we lost a lot of that business. At the same time, though, people were going online quite a lot more than they had been previously. So we found that our like online sales really started to like shoot up. Just like every month was like higher than the next considerably. And of course, like that's also due to the fact that like during the pandemic or, we're still in, but like at that like early point, you're talking like March, April, May, people were really investing in their wellness and self-care. And so they were wanting to make sure they were like getting in those immunity boosters, but then they also were just like, I am so stressed. I'm stuck at the house. I need to do a face mask. I need to make myself a matcha. Like I need some sort of ritual that's just for me. So all of that combined really drove a significant increase in our online business in 2020. And that was the first time with wholesale coming down due to the pandemic and D2C coming up. That was the first time that our numbers flipped. And suddenly our e-commerce business was significantly larger than our wholesale. Then we had, the months of May and June where, following the murder of George Floyd, there was this movement to support Black-owned businesses. And we were just suddenly flooded with visibility that we had never had before. At this time, the full-time team was two, myself and my partner. We had like a couple of people working for us on a part-time basis. And we were getting like hundreds of mentions on social media a day. Like celebrities were shouting us out. Everyone from like the Kardashians to Beyonce were like, oh, check out Gold. So like we were just being flooded. It was exponential. We did more in sales in just the month of June alone than we did in the entire year of 2019.
Whoa.
Yeah. So it was exciting, but it was also a lot. We were sold out of everything. We were back ordered for like months. And on top of it, I was just processing the moment as like a Black person in this country. So 2020 was immensely impactful for our business. And with all of those different things like swirling around, there was kind of like a shift overall that was like, we entered a new dimension of scale that like we just kind of haven't looked back from. So it was a big year for us for sure.
How were you during that time? And now how are you managing things on the back end to be able to scale and meet that kind of growth and demand? And also, were there any things that you were actively doing to tap into that opportunity?
Yeah. I mean, there were a lot of supply chain upgrades we needed to make. We switched out our, production facilities, our, warehouses, like everything needed to be upgraded and engineered for a new level of scale, which was a funny thing to do kind of like in reverse, where you had already hit that scale and you were just trying to like scramble to, make things happen. And then I think outside of that, we really like leaned into who we were as a brand already, of like building online community. And this was a time where folks were feeling very alienated. They were looking for opportunities to connect, to socialize, to feel heard. And so we did a lot of like virtual Zoom events of like where we would like bake a matcha loaf together or like do face masks together and just like create that sense of togetherness, even though we were all trapped in our apartments. So I think that leaning into the moment where it makes sense is really important.
Well, you just mentioned like switching out your suppliers as the company's leveling up. What does that, in a really practical sense, like how do you go and do that? Like how do you find a new supplier that's at a whole different like tier than the one that you're working with now and make that transition? Are there any kind of learnings that you can share?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the best things that you can do is build a lot of relationships with founders who are at your level, a little bit ahead of you, and even like a little bit, I don't want to say behind, but like a little bit smaller than you, so that you can start trading tips. And there are certain things that people won't share. And there are certain things that like we won't share. Like I won't tell people like exactly where we source our packaging from or something, because certain things are proprietary. But when it comes to things like a 3PL or what's called a third party logistics partner, or, a warehouse that's shipping out your product, that's where it can be very, very valuable to have those connections and be able to hear about like which places are great, which places are awful. Definitely get like references from these partners before you go ahead and start with them. Hear about like what the challenges are, like where their strengths are, because these are the people that are, at the end of the day, if it's a supply chain partner or whatever, like to some extent, they're representing your business. You're counting on them. So you need to know that you can trust them to uphold, your standards.
This leads me really nicely actually into my next question, which is the last question I ask everyone on the show. And that is for a resource recommendation. So you just mentioned this community and how helpful other people in the same kind of industry are. But do you have any books, podcasts, anyone that you follow that you think could help other people who are on the same kind of path as you?
Yeah, I would say try to follow along with other founders, like find their social media accounts and follow them, because a lot of folks are starting to share more transparently about their journeys. I try to do that as much as possible on my end. I've got like a little series called Office Hours that like whenever I have a second, I'll just like break down, hey, here's how to think about like supply chain or fundraising, whatever. Someone who I love for this is definitely Sophia Amoruso, previously from Girl Boss and Nasty Gal. She has like a whole like new project now that's like all around like helping entrepreneurs like build their businesses. But even if you just get the chance to like hear her speak, she speaks so transparently about like where she has made mistakes and what she's learned from them. I've always found that to be super inspiring. So,
I said that was my last question, but you've just triggered a new one. So I'm going to ask you. You mentioned like how, a series on Instagram, and I'm always super curious to think about or to understand how different founders think about social media and their own presence on social media. Because I feel like with TikTok and video, there's been this big shift to founders being also the social media face of their brand or needing to like tell that small business storytelling piece of it because it's so compelling as content.
yeah,
How are you approaching that and how are you thinking about that?
I've been out there for a while telling the story. And I think I didn't want to at first. And it was my partner, Issei, who was like, are you kidding me? Like, you got to get out there. Like, there are other young people, other, people of color who like need to know that someone else is doing this and that they can do it too. And so especially like in like the earlier days, I spent as much time as I could, like being transparent about like, hey, here's what's going on right now. What's interesting is I found that like as the business has grown, I've found it harder to like make the time to like be really thoughtful about like sharing all of that. And I find that a lot of founders end up in that position where they're like, okay, so like, what do I spend my time doing? Do I spend my time actually running the business, or do I spend my time like talking about the business and like building out that community around it? And I think it's always a little bit of like give and take there of like finding what feels right for you. And some founders are like really comfortable sharing like every aspect of their lives, talking about like, mental health challenges, whatever. And others like really don't want their personal lives out there. And so I think it's really just like what feels good for you. I would never encourage someone who like wasn't comfortable sharing to just like go out there and share, because like that's what founders do now. I think it's just like see what you want to share, see what resonates with your community, and go from there.
How are you like splitting your time at the moment? What does a day look like? Like what kind of things are you responsible for compared with your partner? Look, I'm just going to keep going with the questions now.
I know. So myself, me and Issa, we kind of lead the business together. So like big strategic decisions are always us discussing them, and like the big strategic meetings, like we're both in them, whatever. Overall, I would say that like between Issa and I'm the talker and he's the listener, which I think helps a lot. Even like when the two of us are in a meeting, like we don't miss anything because we can both kind of like act together to a certain extent. And then like he does a little bit more of the creative, and then I'm a little bit more in like the traditional CEO role. But I feel like we started to kind of like get worked up about like, how are we going to split the role? Like what exactly is going to be you versus me? But like, as we've started to build the team, it's felt very natural. And, most of it is really us together. So that's kind of how it's worked for us so far.
Amazing. Well, Trinity, thank you so much for your time and being so open and transparent with your story. It was great to hear all about you and all about Golde.
Of course. Thanks so much, Jasmine. It was my pleasure.
Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. If you did enjoy the show, please don't forget, leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts.